Harold Mitchell had always been a creature of habit. Every morning, at exactly 7:30, the 78-year-old retired teacher would bundle up in his worn brown coat and step outside his small cottage to collect the morning newspaper. His neighbors in the quiet suburban street of Maple Avenue had grown accustomed to seeing the silver-haired gentleman making his careful way down the front steps, his walking cane tapping rhythmically against the concrete. On this particular February morning, the world outside looked like it had been painted white overnight. Snow had fallen steadily for hours, creating a thick blanket that covered everything in sight. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees, and the wind howled through the bare branches of the old oak trees that lined the street. Most people would have stayed indoors on such a brutal day. But Harold was not most people. He had lived through countless harsh winters during his decades in Minnesota, and a little snow had never stopped him before. His late wife Margaret used to tease him about his stubbornness, saying he would walk through a blizzard just to prove a point. She had been gone for 3 years now, but Harold still maintained the same routines they had shared together as he opened his front door that morning. The icy air hit him like a physical blow. His breath formed small clouds in front of his face, and he pulled his scarf tighter around his neck. The newspaper lay somewhere beneath the snow at the end of his driveway, and he was determined to retrieve it. Harold had been reading the same paper for 45 years, and he was not about to break that streak now. The snow crunched under his feet as he made his way slowly down the front steps. His cane found purchase on each step, and he felt confident despite the treacherous conditions. He had navigated these same steps thousands of times before, and muscle memory guided his movements. What Harold did not realize was that beneath the fresh snow lay a thin sheet of ice that had formed during the night when the temperature had briefly risen and then plummeted again. As he reached for the newspaper with his free hand, his foot slipped on the hidden ice. Time seemed to slow down as Harold felt his body beginning to fall backward. His cane flew from his grip, clattering against the concrete steps. He threw his arms out instinctively, trying to catch himself. But there was nothing to grab onto except the cold morning air. Harold hit the ground hard, his hip taking the brunt of the impact. Pain shot through his body like lightning, and he cried out involuntarily. The sound echoed in the quiet morning air, but the thick snow seemed to muffle everything. He lay there for a moment, stunned and disoriented, trying to understand what had happened. When he attempted to move, the pain in his hip intensified dramatically. He realized with growing alarm that he could not get up. His legs would not respond properly, and every small movement sent waves of agony through his body. Harold had broken his hip, though he did not know the extent of his injuries at the time. The cold was already beginning to seep through his clothes and into his bones. The snow beneath him felt like ice against his back, and he could feel his body temperature starting to drop. Harold tried to call out for help, but his voice seemed weak against the howling wind. The houses around him appeared dark and silent, their windows like empty eyes staring down at him. As the minutes ticked by, Harold began to realize the severity of his situation. He was lying helpless in sub-zero temperatures, unable to move, and with no immediate prospect of rescue. His cell phone was inside the house, sitting uselessly on his kitchen counter. The newspaper that had caused this whole ordeal lay scattered and soggy just a few feet away from where he had fallen. The retired teacher had always prided himself on his independence and self-reliance. He had lived alone successfully for 3 years since Margaret's passing, maintaining his home and taking care of himself without assistance from anyone. Now, for the first time since his wife's death, Harold felt truly vulnerable and afraid. The cold was becoming more intense with each passing moment, and he knew that exposure in these conditions could be fatal. Harold closed his eyes and tried to stay calm, drawing on the inner strength that had carried him through decades of teaching rowdy teenagers, and later through the grief of losing his beloved wife. He told himself that someone would find him soon, that his situation was not as hopeless as it seemed. But as the snow continued to fall around him and the wind grew stronger, doubt began to creep into his thoughts. He had no way of knowing that help was already on its way, in the most unexpected form imaginable. 6 houses down from Harold's cottage, 9-year-old twins Emma and Ethan Rodriguez were pressed against their bedroom window. watching the snow fall in thick, lazy flakes. School had been canceled due to the weather. Their mother had already announced that they would be staying indoors all day. The twins, however, different plans brewing in their young minds. Emma was the more adventurous of the two. With wild curly hair that she refused to let anyone tame into eyes that sparkled with mischief, Ethan was quieter, but equally determined when he set his mind to something. Together, they made a formidable team that had been getting into harmless trouble since they learned to walk. Their golden retriever, Buddy, sat between them, his tail wagging as he sensed their excitement. The 4-year-old dog had been with the family since he was a puppy. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to understand what the twins were thinking. When they were planning an adventure, Buddy always knew first. The twins had been cooped up inside for 2 days already due to the severe weather, and their energy was reaching dangerous levels. Their mother, Maria, was downstairs in the kitchen, preparing hot chocolate and trying to think of activities to keep them occupied. She had no idea that her children were plotting their escape. Emma turned to her brother with a grin that their parents had learned to recognize as trouble. She had spotted their old sled in the garage the day before and had been dreaming of using it ever since the snow started falling. The hill behind their house would be perfect for sledding, she reasoned. And the weather was not really that bad if you dressed warmly enough. Ethan was initially hesitant, knowing that their mother would not approve of them going outside in such conditions. But Emma's enthusiasm was infectious, and soon he found himself nodding in agreement. They would sneak out through the back door, take Buddy with them for protection, and be back inside before their mother even noticed they were gone. The twins spent several minutes gathering their winter gear, trying to be as quiet as possible. They pulled on thermal underwear, snow pants, heavy boots, thick coats, hats, scarves, and mittens. By the time they were finished, they looked like 2 small astronauts preparing for a mission to the Arctic. Buddy watched their preparations with growing excitement, his tail wagging faster with each piece of clothing they put on. Getting out of the house proved easier than they had expected. Their mother was busy in the kitchen with her back to the stairs, and the sound of the radio masked any noise they made. They grabbed their sled from the garage and slipped out through the back door, Buddy trotting beside them with his tongue hanging out despite the frigid air. The world outside was a winter wonderland that took their breath away. Everything was covered in pristine white snow that sparkled like diamonds in the gray morning light. The trees looked like they had been decorated with cotton balls, and the familiar landscape of their neighborhood had been transformed into something magical and mysterious. Emma and Ethan made their way toward the hill behind their house, pulling their sled through the deep snow. Buddy bounded ahead of them, leaping through the drifts like a furry torpedo and barking with pure joy. The cold air stung their faces, but they were too excited to care. As they trudged through the snow, Buddy suddenly stopped and raised his head, his ears perked up and alert. The dog had heard something that the twins could not detect over the sound of the wind. He began barking in a different tone than before, urgent and concerned rather than playful. Emma and Ethan paused, trying to figure out what had caught their dog's attention. Buddy was facing toward the front of their neighborhood, in the direction of Maple Avenue. He continued barking and began moving in that direction, looking back at the twins as if he wanted them to follow. The twins looked at each other uncertainly. They had planned to go sledding on the hill, not wander around the neighborhood. But Buddy was acting strangely, and they had learned to trust their dog's instincts. He had once alerted them to a small fire in their garage, and another time had warned them about a loose dog that was behaving aggressively. Emma made the decision first, as she usually did. She began following Buddy, pulling the sled behind her. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before joining her. The 3 of them made their way through the snow toward the front of the neighborhood, with Buddy leading the way and the twins struggling to keep up with his pace. As they got closer to Maple Avenue, they could hear something that made them slow down and listen more carefully. It was a voice, faint and distant, calling out for help. The twins looked at each other with wide eyes, suddenly realizing that their morning adventure was about to become something much more serious than they had planned. Buddy's barking grew more insistent as the 3 of them approached Maple Avenue. The golden retriever was practically bouncing with urgency, running a few steps forward and then looking back to make sure the twins were following. Emma and Ethan had never seen their usually calm and obedient dog behave this way. Before, the voice they had heard calling for help was getting clearer now, though it sounded weak and strained. As they rounded the corner onto Maple Avenue, they could see a figure lying in the snow near one of the houses. Even from a distance, they could tell that whoever it was needed help badly. Emma felt her heart start beating faster as the reality of the situation hit her. This was not a game or an adventure anymore. Someone was really hurt and depending on them for help. She grabbed Ethan's hand and squeezed it tight, drawing strength from her twin brother as she always did in scary situations. As they got closer, they could see that it was an elderly man lying motionless in the snow near the front steps of a small cottage. He was calling out weakly for help, his voice barely audible over the wind. Snow was collecting on his clothes and in his silver hair, and his face was pale and pinched with cold and pain. Buddy ran straight to the fallen man and began sniffing around him gently, whimpering with concern. The dog seemed to understand instinctively that this person was in serious trouble and needed their help. He looked back at the twins with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to be saying, "We have to do something." Emma and Ethan approached cautiously, not sure what they should do. They had never encountered a real emergency before, and their parents had always been there to handle any problems that arose. Now they were on their own, and the weight of responsibility felt enormous on their small shoulders. Harold heard the sound of children's voices and felt a surge of hope that he had not expected. He opened his eyes and saw two small figures bundled up in winter clothes standing near him, along with a large golden dog that was watching him with concerned eyes. For a moment, he wondered if he was hallucinating from the cold. "Are you okay, mister?" Emma asked, her voice shaking slightly. She could see that the man was shivering uncontrollably, and she remembered her mother telling her that this was a sign of dangerous cold exposure. Harold tried to speak, but found that his voice was barely a whisper. "I fell," he managed to say. "I think my hip is broken. I cannot get up." The effort of speaking seemed to exhaust him. He closed his eyes again. Ethan moved closer and knelt down in the snow beside Harold. Despite his young age, he had always been good in crisis situations, able to think clearly when others panicked. "We need to get help," he said to his sister. "He is really hurt, and he has been out here too long." Emma nodded, but her mind was racing. They were supposed to be at home, and their mother did not even know they were outside. If they went back to get help, would they get in trouble? More importantly, would there be enough time? The old man looked like he was getting worse by the minute. Buddy solved part of their problem by lying down next to Harold and pressing his warm body against the elderly man's side. The dog's thick fur and body heat provided some insulation against the cold, and Harold seemed to relax slightly. Buddy looked up at the twins as if to say, "I will stay with him while you figure out what to do." Emma made a quick decision. "You stay here with Buddy and the man," she told her brother. "I will run home and get Mom. She will know what to do." She started to turn away, but Ethan grabbed her arm. "Wait," he said. "What if he gets worse while you are gone? What if we cannot keep him warm enough?" His concerns were valid, and Emma felt torn between the need to get adult help and the fear of leaving the injured man. It was then that Emma remembered the sled they had brought with them. An idea began to form in her mind, crazy and dangerous, but possibly their best option. She looked at the sled, then at Harold, then at her brother. "What if we do not leave him here?" she said slowly. "What if we take him with us?" Ethan stared at her in shock. "Emma, we cannot move someone who is hurt. Mom always says you should not move injured people, but he cannot stay here," Emma insisted. "Look at him. He is freezing. If we leave him here much longer, he might die before we can get back with help." Harold had been listening to their conversation through a haze of pain and cold. He realized that these brave children were trying to save his life, and he felt overwhelmed with gratitude. He also understood that they were facing an impossible choice. He wanted to help them make the right decision. "Children," he whispered, forcing himself to speak louder. "The sled, it might work. I am not heavy and you seem strong. It is worth trying." He looked at them with eyes that were clearer now. Focused by the urgency of their situation, Emma and Ethan looked at each other, communicating in the wordless way that twins often do. They both knew it was risky, but they also knew that doing nothing was even more dangerous. They had to try to save this man, even if it meant taking a chance that might make things worse. The twins began to plan their rescue mission, while Buddy continued to provide warmth and comfort to Harold. None of them realized that their actions over the next few minutes would not only save a life, but would also change all of their lives forever. Moving Harold onto the sled proved to be more challenging than the twins had anticipated. Despite his claim that he was not heavy, the elderly man was still a full-grown adult, and Emma and Ethan were just 9 years old. However, what they lacked in size, they made up for in determination and creative thinking. Emma positioned the sled as close to Harold as possible, while Ethan worked to clear away the snow around him. Buddy seemed to understand what they were trying to do and moved aside to give them room to work. Though he stayed close enough to provide encouragement and warmth, Harold tried to help as much as he could. But the pain in his hip was excruciating, and he had been lying in the cold for nearly an hour. His muscles were stiff and unresponsive, and he felt weaker than he had ever felt in his life. Still, he was amazed by the courage and ingenuity of these two children who had appeared like angels in his moment of greatest need. The twins quickly realized that they would need to roll Harold onto the sled rather than trying to lift him. Emma took off her thick winter coat and spread it on the sled to provide extra padding and warmth. Ethan did the same with his coat. Despite the fact that the frigid air immediately began cutting through his remaining layers of clothing, working together, they managed to help Harold roll slowly and carefully onto the sled. Every movement caused him to groan with pain, and the twins winced in sympathy. They could see that he was suffering. But they also knew that getting him to safety was worth the temporary discomfort. Once Harold was positioned on the sled, Emma and Ethan worked to make him as comfortable as possible. They tucked their coats around him like blankets and made sure his injured leg was supported. Buddy climbed onto the sled as well, curling up next to Harold to provide additional body heat. The next challenge was figuring out how to pull the sled with all the weight on it. Harold was not particularly large, but combined with Buddy and the winter coats, the load was substantial for two small children. Emma took the rope at the front of the sled, while Ethan positioned himself at the side to help guide and push. Their progress was slow and difficult. The deep snow made it hard to gain traction, and several times the sled got stuck or veered off course. But the twins refused to give up. They had committed to saving this man, and they were going to see it through no matter how hard it became. Harold drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey, sometimes aware of the twins' labored breathing and Buddy's warm presence beside him, and other times lost in a haze of pain and cold. During his lucid moments, he was struck by the incredible selflessness of these children. They were risking their own safety and comfort to help a complete stranger. As they made their way slowly through the snow, Emma began to worry about what their mother would say when they arrived home with an injured stranger. They had disobeyed her by going outside, and now they were bringing home a medical emergency. She hoped that their mother would understand that they had done the right thing, even if they had broken the rules to do it. Ethan was thinking similar thoughts, but he was also focused on the practical challenges of their situation. Harold needed medical attention immediately, and even if they got him home safely, they would still need to call for professional help. He hoped that the emergency services would be able to respond despite the severe weather conditions. Buddy remained alert throughout the journey, occasionally jumping down from the sled to run ahead and scout the path. Then, returning to his position beside Harold, the intelligent dog seemed to understand that his job was to keep the injured man warm and provide comfort during the difficult trip. About halfway to their house, Emma began to feel exhausted. Her muscles ached from pulling the heavy sled. The cold was starting to affect her now that she was without her winter coat. She paused to rest for a moment. Breathing heavily and trying to gather her strength, Ethan saw his sisters distress and immediately offered to take over the rope. They switched positions, with Emma moving to the side to help guide while Ethan took on the burden of pulling. This teamwork and mutual support had always been their strength, and it served them well in this crisis. Harold noticed the switch and felt a surge of emotion. These children were sacrificing so much to help him, taking turns and sharing the load without complaint. He had taught hundreds of students during his career as an educator, but he had rarely seen such maturity and compassion from children so young, as they approached the Rodriguez family's house. Emma began to call out for their mother. She wanted to give Maria some warning that they were coming and that they had a medical emergency with them. The last thing they needed was for their mother to be shocked and unprepared for what they were bringing home. The twins could see lights on in their house and smoke rising from the chimney, signs of the warm, safe haven that awaited them. They pushed themselves harder, knowing that they were almost at the end of their rescue mission. Harold would soon be safe and warm. Professional help could be summoned to address his injuries properly. Neither of the twins realized it yet. But their brave actions on this cold morning would make them heroes in their community and would forge a bond with Harold that would last for the rest of their lives. Maria Rodriguez was in the middle of preparing lunch when she heard Emma's voice calling from outside. At first, she thought she was imagining things, since she had specifically told the twins to stay indoors due to the dangerous weather conditions. But as the calling continued and grew louder, she realized with growing alarm that her children were actually outside. She rushed to the back door and threw it open, ready to scold Emma and Ethan for disobeying her instructions. But the sight that greeted her stopped her words before they could form. Her two children were pulling a sled through the deep snow, and on that sled was an elderly man wrapped in their winter coats. Along with Buddy, Maria's training as a nurse kicked in immediately, overriding her confusion and concern about how the situation had developed. She could see at a glance that the man was in serious medical distress, likely suffering from hypothermia and possibly other injuries. Her scolding of the twins would have to wait. She ran outside without stopping to put on her own coat, her maternal instincts and professional training taking over completely. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but she ignored it as she rushed to help her children and their unexpected patient. "Bring them inside quickly," she commanded, taking the rope from Ethan and helping to pull the sled toward the back door. "Emma, run ahead and clear the coffee table in the living room. We need to get him warm immediately." Harold was barely conscious by this point, but he was aware enough to realize that he was being taken care of by someone with medical knowledge. The authoritative tone in Maria's voice and the efficient way she took charge of the situation gave him hope that he was going to be all right. Getting Harold from the sled into the house required careful coordination. Maria positioned herself at his head and shoulders while the twins supported his legs. Buddy jumped down from the sled and ran into the house ahead of them, as if to announce their arrival and make sure the coast was clear. Once they had Harold settled on the couch, Maria began her assessment. She could see that he was showing classic signs of hypothermia, confusion, shivering, slurred speech, and dangerously pale skin. She also suspected that he had sustained other injuries, possibly a broken hip based on the way he was favoring one side. While she worked too warm, Harold with blankets and hot water bottles, Maria fired questions at the twins. How long had he been outside? Where did they find him? What had happened to cause his injuries? Emma and Ethan answered as best they could, their voices shaking with exhaustion in the aftermath of their heroic effort. Maria was amazed by what her children had accomplished. They had not only found Harold and recognized that he needed help, but they had also figured out a way to transport him to safety, despite their young age and small size. She felt proud of their courage and quick thinking. Even as she worried about the risks they had taken, as Harold began to warm up, he became more alert and coherent. The first thing he did was thank the twins for saving his life. His voice was still weak, but his gratitude was unmistakable. Emma and Ethan looked at each other with shy smiles. Beginning to realize the magnitude of what they had accomplished, Maria called for an ambulance. Though she was not sure how quickly emergency services would be able to respond given the weather conditions. In the meantime, she continued to treat Harold's hypothermia and made him as comfortable as possible. She gave him warm liquids to drink and monitored his vital signs carefully. While they waited for professional medical help to arrive, Harold began to tell them about himself. He explained that he was a retired teacher who lived alone, and that he had fallen while trying to retrieve his morning newspaper. He had been lying in the snow for over an hour before the twins found him, and he was certain that he would not have survived much longer without their intervention. The twins listened, with wide eyes, as Harold described his experience. They had not fully understood how serious his situation had been or how close he had come to dying from exposure. The weight of what they had done began to sink in, and they felt both proud and slightly overwhelmed. Buddy had appointed himself as Harold's personal guardian and refused to leave his side. The golden retriever lay on the floor next to the couch, keeping watch over the elderly man with alert, protective eyes. Harold reached down to pet the dog's head, grateful for the warmth and comfort that Buddy had provided during the rescue. Maria observed the bond that was already forming between Harold and her family. There was something special about the way the old man looked at her children, and she could see that this experience had affected all of them deeply. She had a feeling that this was the beginning of a relationship that would enrich all of their lives. When the ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics were impressed by Maria's treatment of Harold and by the incredible story of how he had been rescued. They confirmed that he had a broken hip and severe hypothermia, but they also said that the quick action of the twins had undoubtedly saved his life. As Harold was being prepared for transport to the hospital, he made Emma and Ethan promise to visit him once he was feeling better. He wanted to properly thank them and get to know the remarkable children who had risked their own safety to save a stranger. The twins eagerly agreed, already looking forward to seeing their new friend again. Harold spent 5 days in the hospital recovering from his broken hip and the effects of severe hypothermia. The surgery to repair his hip went well, but the doctors were more concerned about the damage caused by his prolonged exposure to the cold. They told him repeatedly that he was incredibly fortunate to be alive, and that if he had remained outside for even another 30 minutes, the outcome could have been very different. During his hospital stay, Harold found himself thinking constantly about Emma and Ethan. He had received cards and flowers from various neighbors and former colleagues, but the memory of those two brave children kept returning to his mind. He wanted to do something special to thank them, but he was not sure what would be appropriate. The twins visited him on his 3rd day in the hospital, accompanied by their mother and Buddy, who had been granted special permission to enter the building as a therapy dog for the day. Harold's face lit up when he saw them walk into his room, and he felt stronger immediately just from their presence. Emma and Ethan were initially shy and uncertain in the hospital setting, but Harold quickly put them at ease by asking them about school, their hobbies, and their plans for the rest of the winter break. He discovered that Emma loved to draw and paint, while Ethan was fascinated by science and nature. Both children were excellent students who enjoyed reading and learning new things. As they talked, Harold began to form an idea. He had been a teacher for over 40 years, and he had always believed in the power of education to transform lives. These children had shown such courage and compassion at such a young age, and he wanted to help nurture those qualities as they grew up. Before the twins left that day, Harold made them an offer that surprised everyone in the room. He asked if they would be interested in spending time with him after he recovered, learning about topics that interested them. He could help Emma develop her artistic skills and assist Ethan with science projects. In return, they could help him with tasks around his house and provide the companionship that he had been missing since his wife's death. Maria was touched by Harold's offer, but she wanted to make sure that he was not feeling obligated to repay her children for their help. Harold assured her that his suggestion came from genuine affection and a desire to be useful again. He explained that having a purpose and people to care about would be as beneficial to him as any medicine doctors could prescribe. The twins were thrilled by the prospect of having a grandfather figure in their lives. Their own grandparents lived far away and they rarely saw them. Harold seemed wise and kind, and they sensed that he had many interesting stories to tell and knowledge to share. When Harold was finally released from the hospital, the Rodriguez family was there to pick him up and drive him home. His cottage looked exactly the same as it had before the accident, but Harold felt like a different person. The experience of nearly dying and then being saved by 2 children had given him a new perspective on life and a renewed sense of purpose. The twins helped Harold settle back into his routine. But now that routine included daily visits from his young friends. Emma would come over in the afternoons to paint watercolors at Harold's kitchen table, while Harold taught her about different techniques in art history. Ethan would arrive after dinner to work on science experiments in Harold's garage, which they had converted into a makeshift laboratory. Buddy had also become a regular visitor to Harold's house. seeming to understand that the elderly man still needed protection and companionship. The dog would spend hours lying at Harold's feet while he read or worked with the twins, always alert and ready to provide comfort when needed. As the weeks passed, the bond between Harold and the Rodriguez family grew stronger. He became like a beloved grandfather to Emma and Ethan, attending their school plays and sporting events, helping with homework, and sharing stories from his decades as a teacher. The twins brought energy and laughter back into his life, while he provided them with wisdom, patience, and unconditional support. Maria watched this relationship develop with wonder and gratitude. Her children were learning so much from Harold, not just academic subjects, but also important life lessons about kindness, perseverance, and the value of helping others. She could see them growing more confident and mature under his gentle guidance. Harold's neighbors on Maple Avenue also noticed the change in him. Where once he had been a solitary figure going through the motions of daily life, he now seemed vibrant and purposeful. The sound of children's laughter could often be heard coming from his house, and visitors were a regular sight at his front door. The story of the rescue had spread throughout the community, and Harold, Emma, and Ethan had become local celebrities. Newspaper reporters came to interview them, and they were invited to speak at community events about heroism and helping neighbors. But for all involved, the real reward was the loving relationship that had grown from that cold morning when fate had brought them together. Harold knew that he owed his life to those two remarkable children and their intuitive dog. But as he watched Emma and Ethan flourish under his mentorship, he realized that they had given him something even more precious than life itself. They had given him a reason to live and a family to love again. 2 years after the rescue, Harold's small cottage had been transformed into the unofficial neighborhood gathering place. What had once been a quiet, lonely home was now filled with the constant buzz of activity and the sounds of young voices. Emma and Ethan had not only maintained their friendship with Harold, but they had also brought other children from the neighborhood into a circle. Harold had discovered that he missed teaching more than he had realized, and he began offering free tutoring sessions in his living room. Word spread quickly among parents in the area, and soon Harold found himself helping a dozen different children with their homework and school projects every week. His dining room table was always covered with textbooks, art supplies, and science experiments. Emma had blossomed as an artist under Harold's guidance. Her paintings now decorated the walls of his house, and she had won several competitions at school and in the community. More importantly, she had developed a deep appreciation for beauty and creativity that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Harold had taught her to see the world through an artist's eyes. Finding inspiration in everyday moments and ordinary objects, Ethan had become fascinated with environmental science. Inspired by Harold's stories about how the natural world had changed during his lifetime, together, they had created a small weather station in Harold's backyard and had begun documenting climate patterns and seasonal changes. Ethan's science fair projects, developed with Harold's help, had earned recognition at the state level. Buddy, now 6 years old, had appointed himself as the official greeter for all of Harold's visitors. The golden retriever had an uncanny ability to sense which children needed extra comfort or encouragement, and he would position himself accordingly. Several parents had commented that their shy or anxious children seemed to relax immediately. When Buddy approached them, the rescue story had taken on a life of its own in the community. Local schools began using it as an example when teaching children about courage, kindness, and helping neighbors. The city council had even declared February 15th as Good Neighbor Day in honor of the anniversary of Harold's rescue. Each year, the community held a small celebration, and Harold, Emma, and Ethan were invited to speak about their experience. But perhaps the most significant change was in Harold himself. The man who had once been content to live a quiet, isolated existence had become a pillar of the community. He had discovered that his years of teaching experience, combined with his newfound appreciation for life, made him uniquely qualified to mentor young people who were facing challenges. Harold began working with the local youth center, helping teenagers who were struggling academically or socially. He found that his gentle approach and genuine interest in their lives made him an effective counselor and role model. Many of these young people reminded him of students he had taught decades earlier, and he was able to draw on that experience to provide guidance and support. Maria Rodriguez often marveled at how much her family's life had changed since that snowy morning. Her children had learned lessons about compassion and bravery that no classroom could have taught them. They had also gained a loving grandfather figure who enriched their lives in countless ways. She frequently told friends that finding Harold that day had been a blessing for everyone involved. The relationship between Harold and the twins continued to evolve as they grew older. Emma, now 11, was beginning to think seriously about a career in art, and Harold had connected her with local artists and art teachers who could provide advanced instruction. Ethan, also 11, had developed such a passion for environmental science that he was already talking about studying biology in college. Harold took great pride in watching the twins develop their talents and interests. He had kept detailed scrapbooks documenting their achievements and milestones, just as he had once done for his own students. But this relationship was different from his teaching career because it was personal and ongoing. He was not just educating Emma and Ethan, he was helping to shape the people they would become. As Harold approached his 80th birthday, he reflected on the unexpected turn his life had taken. The accident that had nearly killed him had instead led to the most fulfilling period of his life. He had learned that age was not a barrier to forming new relationships or making meaningful contributions to others' lives. The twins had taught him that heroism could come in small packages, and that sometimes the people who need rescuing are not the ones lying helpless in the snow. Harold realized that Emma and Ethan had rescued him from loneliness and purposelessness just as surely as they had saved him from freezing too. On quiet evenings, when the tutoring sessions were finished and the house was peaceful, Harold would sit in his favorite chair with Buddy at his feet and think about the chain of events that had brought so much joy into his final years. A simple fall on an icy morning had led to a rescue that saved not just one life, but had enriched an entire community. Harold knew that his time was limited, but he also knew that the impact of that cold February morning would continue long after he was gone. Emma and Ethan would carry the lessons they had learned about helping others throughout their lives. The children he tutored would remember his kindness and patience. The community would continue to celebrate the power of neighbors, helping neighbors. Most importantly, Harold had learned that it is never too late to become part of a family, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as emergencies. The twins and their brave dog had given him far more than he could ever give them in return, and for that, he would be grateful for the rest of his days.